It is a truth universally acknowledged that a country at war must be in search of an enemy. What is less well known is how much cooperation goes into that enmity. While it takes a remarkable amount of coordination to arrange a battle, the best example of this may well be prisoners of war. Treatment, logistics, exchange, all sorted by prearranged agreements called cartels. But what happens when the two countries at war start as one nation? Tonight, in the first installment of an epic two-parter, Trenton Cole Jones, award-winning historian and associate professor at Purdue University, talks to us about how the American Revolutionary War shattered the laws of war, brought back the wars of religion, and why American civil wars are always, in the end, about slavery. This is Captives of Liberty, Prisoners of War and the Politics of Vengeance in the American Revolution, Part 1, up next on the Napoleonic Wars podcast. Hello! As you can hear by the slight twang and the dulcet tones of this introduction, the Beau is back in charge. To make matters worse, Zack's worst fears are coming true, for he is once again outnumbered by uppity colonialists, both of whom, in this case, are strong advocates of tweed. Yes, we are back in the world of the American Revolution and the early Republic. Sadly, we're not here to talk about fashion today, though. We're talking about something much more brutal. We're talking about prisoners of war. And to do that, I've recruited one of the first people I met in my graduate studies journey, the one and only Trenton Cole Jones. Cole is an associate professor in Purdue University's Department of History, and his first book, Captives of Liberty, Prisoners of War and the Politics of Vengeance in the American Revolution, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press Early American Studies series in 2019, and subsequently won the 2021 Society of the Cincinnati Prize from the American Revolution Institute. A paperback edition was published in 2022, and I highly recommend that you get yourself a copy of it because it's a stirring read. Thank you for joining us, Cole. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me, Luke. And it's very nice to meet you, Zach.
Somebody being nice to me on this show when Luke's in the room. This is unheard of.
It won't
Clearly,
last.
yes, I was going to say clearly you didn't get the memo. So it's thank you. You are very welcome because the lack of abuse from an American is a rare thing on this show. But yeah, lovely to have met you. I have quite enjoyed Luke's efforts on the opening to that. The edit will save his blushes. I will leave the commentary to that. But it's not quite as easy as it sometimes appears when you're in the
I
hot
have
seat,
never
is it, mate?
maintained that that particular part was easy. I mean, all credit to you. I have never once said that sort of that wasn't part of the job. And we've had whole conversations about how hard it is to do all that stuff in one take, especially if you're on video.
Yeah, it's a challenge. But as you can see, the balance of power is shifting in this podcast. At least for this episode. You know, occasionally it's important to let the Beau stretch his legs and realize that he can acquire as many flashy titles as he likes. But sometimes, like you have to work to acquire certain ranks.
All podcast hosts are equal, Zach, but some are more equal than others.
That is a motto that we can stick on a mug. I shall speak to the quartermaster, Mr. Telfer, immediately. Right, to business, and this is going to be a complex one because I'm increasingly fond of the idea that the American Revolution slash War of Independence is fundamentally a civil war, a second British Civil War, or a second English Civil War, or a first British Civil War. Let's go with that one. The first British Civil War, the second English Civil War, and the zero point 0.5 US Civil War. There we go. Those are all definitely things that I didn't make up off the top of my head. So I'm very curious to hear how this goes in terms of the dynamic between both sides in this and the treatment of individuals. But we do need to kind of start with the basics. And so I want to talk about the rules fundamentally with the fabric of the system. things like parole, the role of honor, these ideas that hold the system together, and I I would argue are sort of integral to how certainly the officer corps is meant to operate in theory, though not necessarily in practice. So talk us through the theory of how this system should have worked, particularly in more, dare I say, traditional circumstances of two nations who both recognize each other as independent nations, dealing with prisoners that they acquire through conflict.
Excellent, Zach. Thank you for that. I feel like we're going to need to talk at some point about your notion of British civil wars versus English civil wars, a civil war perhaps in the British Empire, perhaps the first American Civil War. I'd like to get into that in more depth, but I'll first start by tackling your very good question, which is what are the sort of norms? What are the unspoken rules that early modern Europeans and their colonists had when it came to the issue of captivity and conflict, war prisoners, prisoners of war, right? Uh, Historians have observed for a long time that the American Revolution, of course, occurs in the late 18th century, an age in which before Napoleon, right, and an age in which historians have oftentimes characterized as a period of limited wars, as an age of restrained, perhaps even if dare one use the phrase humanitarian conflict between European powers, an age in which European monarchs had achieved some modicum of control over the apparatus of state violence and force, and used armies to contest issues of dynastic succession, borders, the balance of power, trade, commerce, and other things. They're not fighting in the late 18th century in Western Europe over issues of confessional allegiance the way they had done, say, in the 17th century and the age of the religious wars, 16th and 17th centuries. So, in effect, what scholars point to is that your early modern Europeans, late early modern Europeans shared a sense of we call them rules, right, for how war should be conducted. Now, these were famously codified by legal jurists such as Hugo Grotius in his 1625 treatise on the laws of war and peace. Most famously for our purposes by Emmer de Vattel, a Swiss jurist who published in 1758 his Law of Nations, which laid down the sort of parameters by which European powers should conduct war. The goal here being to limit the sort of extreme violence that one witnessed during, say, the 30 Years' War, sacking of towns, destruction of crops, and waging war on the civilian population, for instance. And in fact, that the violence of war, while necessary to achieve political goals, right? If war is just the continuation of politics, while still necessary, could be confined to the locus of the battlefield between armies of, we won't quite use the term professional in a sort of Sam Huntington way, but we might say regulars, regular troops paid by the state, and that these forces could be controlled and their violence could be limited, right? The officer corps, largely drawn from the gentry and minor nobility throughout Europe, would share a sort of common code of honor. And there's been a lot of work on this about what it means to be honorable in war. But one of the key components, of course, is accepting your opponent's word of honor if they are disarmed and captured, not to try and run away, not to try and flee, and to wait for repatriation through equitable exchange. I'm reminded of a quip, I'll probably get it wrong, from Winston Churchill when he said, "A prisoner of war is someone who tries to kill you, fails, and then asks you not to kill him." And in effect, that's going to happen in these conflicts, right? They're not fighting to the death so much as trying to outmaneuver their opponents, achieve strategic advantage to force their rival kingdom into a advantageous peace. So captives can actually become quite valuable. Not certainly, of course, officers who claim descent from the knights of old and therefore could claim some right, I suppose, to ransom, that they might be ransomed for by their relatives or perhaps by their king. But here, this is also by, say, the 18th century, is applying to common soldiers as well, who on the battlefields of medieval Europe might have been butchered, right? But now they actually have some tangible value for the purpose of exchange. And European powers by, let's say, again, mid-18th century, had developed elaborate treaties known as cartels for the exchange of prisoners. The idea being that we capture some of your guys, you have some of ours. Within a certain amount of time that we agree at the beginning of the conflict, we will swap them equitably. Usually it's private soldier for private soldier, officers by rank for officers by rank. There were, in fact, tables drawn up. How many sergeants does it take to make a captain? How many lieutenants need you capture in order to exchange for a major, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea, of course, is that you don't hold prisoners for very long, and that you use them for the purpose of reacquiring your captive regular troops, who, as both of you know, of course, were very expensive to train a good regular. And so we want them back. These are not the mass armies of the 1790s. These are much smaller forces, and therefore they're quite valuable to the monarchs that field them, right? And so these rules had been codified by legal jurists, as I mentioned, but we're more than that. In many ways, Vattel is just sort of a publicist, as one scholar calls, for what I call sort of culture of war in early modern Europe that is common. It's commonly held across the battle lines during, say, the War of the Austrian Succession, the Seven Years' War, etc. And so that is the context into which plucky American colonists will find themselves when they resort to violence to redress their grievances with Parliament over the issue of representation and parliamentary sovereignty.
Let's stay with the practicalities of this then, because logistically, this is a headache. As you say, we are not yet in the system that perhaps our listeners are more familiar with, that becomes prominent the further you go into the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, where you have sort of this much greater reticence towards exchange of rank and file, where you have the need for things like prison hulks and all the rest of it. But there is still a logistical challenge to this. If you take prisoners of war, they are fundamentally an impediment to your progress. You have to devote men to guard them. You have to divert resources to feed them. Otherwise, you are maltreating your prisoners, and that is contrary to the laws such as they exist of war. So how logistically do you resolve that? I mean, you talk about sort of this desire to exchange fairly rapidly. Now, that's great in principle, but equally, if you are sweeping an enemy before you, that becomes quite a significant challenge on two counts. One, you need momentum. You need to maintain that momentum. Secondly, you need to make sure that those individuals that you're taking, and you'll be taking them in large numbers, if you're securing sort of significant victories over your enemy, that therefore means that you've got to divert a lot of men, because you've got a lot of men to guard, right? So how do, on a practical level, how does that work out?
You're exactly right. These cartels that are signed between belligerent powers at the onset of hostilities are very idealized. This is like under best case scenario, this is how it's going to work, realizing that the exigencies of war are what they are. For instance, the cartel signed between France and Great Britain during the Seven Years' War stipulated that prisoners should be exchanged within 2 weeks, which is an incredibly rapid amount of time, as you can imagine, especially when one is considering that this is a global war for empire, not just being fought in Flanders. So there are certainly logistical challenges. The first and foremost you point to is just feeding them, right? Soldiers, armies march on their stomach, right? I think that's a Napoleon quote, something to that effect. And so therefore you have to be able to provide these prisoners with food, lest they claim mistreatment, right? So what these cartels would stipulate is, in fact, that each army would appoint a commissary officer, commissary of prisoners, to reside with the enemy army, for the purpose of supplying their own captives in enemy hands. So this can be a bit counterintuitive, and it's going to cause all kinds of problems in the American Revolution. But if the armies of France and Great Britain are at war, the French should have a commissary officer that is with the British at any given time. Usually, these are oftentimes merchants, not actually commissioned officers, whose job it is to then supply their own prisoners, French troops in British custody, right? So, now this again is logistically challenging. It certainly doesn't always work this way. Very oftentimes, what armies will do is develop a sort of running tally, saying, "Okay, we're going to advance these French soldiers, we, the Crown of Great Britain, are going to advance these French soldiers, these rations, new suit of clothes, blankets, etc., for this amount of period. And then when we can settle up with the French, we know they're good for it. They'll pay us back, right? And so records are kept on this in this way. So that's the sort of first logistical challenge is that you're paying for your prisoners in enemy hands while the enemy is paying for their prisoners in your hands, sort of reverse of what we might expect. So that's the sort of first issue there. As for guarding them, yeah, there are certainly issues with security breaches, and perhaps you could have restive captives that might try to escape and whatnot. So you would have to devote some forces to this. Officers, as members of the sort of pan-European gentry or gentlemen officers, would share this common code of honor, where you would accept an officer's parole, from the French meaning word, their word of honor, not to try to escape until they could be properly exchanged. Sometimes these officers would live on with the hospitality of their fellow officers on the opposing side. Oftentimes, they would simply be brought to the nearest town and allowed to rent lodgings there, for instance. Sometimes they were allowed to be permitted to return home as long as they don't serve until they are equitably exchanged. So arranging an exchange becomes really important for many of these officers who are keen to get back into the field, generally speaking. So those are the sort of logistical issues at play. It's easier in Europe than it is in America. One of the things that I found quite interesting is just how conscientious the British during the Seven Years' War, and particularly Geoffrey Amherst, was to upholding as close as possible to the letter of these terms with his French counterpart, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, the French Governor General in Canada. They're really trying to repatriate French captives as quickly as possible, in part so they can get paid back for the expenses that they have allocated to these French prisoners, but also so they can retrieve their own prisoners in enemy hands. And at this point, the Canadians have a large number of New Englanders in particular, who their indigenous allies who had captured and then been ransomed to the French in Quebec. So that's Amherst's qualms, but he's really quite committed to upholding sort of European norms on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So it's certainly this there are these norms on paper, sort of, well, they're the unspoken norms, then they're the written laws on paper, then there's the reality of the situation on the ground in Western Europe, and then that's compounded, obviously, in the colonies. But what struck me is not so much the breaches of the sort of etiquette of war, the rules of war, but just how common adherence to them was by, say, the middle decades of the 18th century. So it's really quite a sophisticated system that really does serve to limit the destructiveness of combat in this period, right? These obviously the armies are much smaller than they would be 30 years later during your period, but But these rules and the commitment that European officers and diplomats uh, have to them, I think, are responsible, at least in part, for this notion we have of the wars of the 18th century as being these limited conflicts.
You know, listening to you, I'm reminded about that old truth that I always have to tell students, and that sort of the people who are first coming into military history don't understand, which is how much cooperation war requires. Whether it's these prisoners or whether it's just getting two armies onto the same damn field at the same damn time in order to slaughter each other. The other thing that and I think you've touched on this a little bit, with sort of the unwritten rules versus the written rules versus the sort of the norms. But the other thing that I really want you to sort of just lay out for our listeners is the notion of monopoly of violence. And some in the some on the European side may be more familiar with this term as the royal monopoly of force. This sort of the term that Louis the 13th and Louis the 14th give it. But can you walk us through this concept as a whole?
Sure, this is, one of the bedrocks of political science, dating back to Max Weber. We can see it, of course, in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, the idea that the state, in order to be effective, must control all legitimate sources of violence. So we cannot have fractious nobles with their own private armies of mercenaries running around pillaging the countryside if we're going to have an effective early modern state. Obviously, Louis the 14th is the great paragon of this and his centralizing power over his nobility, creating a large standing army and then using that to push his European rivals around. But this is by the 18th century, it's sort of taken for granted that that the crown or the principalities will have a control over war. That war is not something for private individuals. The sort of the feuds and vendettas of 16th century, the bands of mercenaries running around Germany, pillaging and sacking towns. That's a thing of the past, in part because of the revulsion that early modern Europeans had to that destruction. But I also think just the sort of realpolitik of these European monarchs who seek to consolidate power in their own hands, right? Oftentimes at the expense of their nobility. Their nobility, however, are very often willing to accept a colonel's commission to pay for a regiment in the king's army and go and off and demonstrate their martial prowess on the field of battle, but now in the name of a king instead of their own private interests. And so that is again by the period that we're talking about in the 18th century just taken for granted that there is legitimate violence and there's not legitimate violence. And so any type of rebellion against what is seen as a lawful state is a form of illegitimate violence in the minds of the state itself, right? Vattel actually goes to great lengths in the Law of Nations talking about this, saying that subjects need to put up with a whole lot. You have to put up with a whole lot of abuse as a subject of a legitimate power, a legitimate state, before you can invoke the right of resistance and engage in rebellion. That rebellion and then civil war should be avoided if at all possible. John Locke might disagree with that when it comes to the right of resistance. But the idea here again is that by the 18th century, the monarchs of Europe have achieved this monopoly on violence. They have royally paid for, or in the case of Great Britain, parliamentary financed standing armies, even in peacetime, of trained regulars who operate according to codes of military justice, right? So soldiers can't just go around pillaging and plundering the countryside, engaging in violence against civilians. This would sort of undermine the authority of the state if you had your army going around just stealing things. And now, of course, this doesn't mean that doesn't happen. And I'm sure I know Luke and actually I believe Zach, your work has been somewhat on military justice, right? So if you read court martials long enough, you understand that early modern soldiers will get up to nefarious deeds all the time. But at least in theory, the crown has this monopoly on violence, and therefore it's the right of the military to punish soldiers if they act in an infraction against those codes of military justice.
I love your phrasing of this as sort of, is sort of narration of the rise of an absolutist state in a weird way through that, and sort of the, war is not something left to private individuals. But ask, walk into the Continental Congress and ask them who they are, and they'll say we're a collection of private individuals. So how does this shape? I mean, you touched on revolution a little bit, but I want to go a little further. How does this shape in the American context?
Hmm. It's very good. Before we get to revolution, I want to start with rebellion. Early modern Europeans are not they're very aware of rebellions. This is not something that is in the dismal past. You need only look to 1745 and 46 to see within the British home islands a major rebellion of primarily Highland Scots, but also people from Northern England seeking to restore the Stuarts, the exiled, the old pretender to the throne of Great Britain. It's the Jacobite Rebellion that was the third in a series in the 18th century alone. And so the idea that a rival power could challenge the legitimacy of a state and use armed force to do that is certainly not new. Rebellions, of course, by their very nature, call into question the legitimacy of the state itself. And therefore, you can't just allow a rebellion to exist, to persist, because it would discredit your authority to rule, to govern, to maintain this monopoly on violence that is so central to state formation. So, consequently, European powers, Great Britain certainly among them, are perfectly willing to use their standing army to engage in rather extreme forms of violence against the rebels and those who harbor them to suppress these insurrections, what they would see as treasonable, execrable rebellions. And so but American colonists do not see themselves as rebels, right? So we need to back up just a little bit and understand what they're trying to achieve. I would posit that they're not trying to achieve a rebellion, nor are they trying to achieve, certainly they're not trying to achieve a revolution. The people we would term patriots who use this term are invoking what they see as the English liberties guaranteed them by the Declaration of Right, 1689, the Glorious Revolution, that they are freeborn English subjects entitled to the same rights and privileges as any Briton anywhere within the empire, at home or abroad. And they are merely trying to lawfully, righteously resist the usurpating tyranny of Parliament. Parliament exerting itself and taking upon itself powers that they would see as belonging to the royal prerogative, and so having nothing to do with Parliament's jurisdiction. And so they are initially trying to protest, right, by organizing committees, writing letters, sending pamphlets, newspapers, whatnot. It's going to escalate into a form of ritualized and controlled violence. And these we can point to, say, the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 as more of an attack on property and sort of symbolic violence, burning in effigies, things like that, as a way of escalating the situation. All of this is very would fall within the norms of early modern protest culture. The idea of sort of rough music as a way of how crowds can perform these really controlled acts of violence as a way of protesting against perceived violations of their traditional rights and privileges. And so that's what we call the revolutionaries, are really doing. When they call themselves patriots, they're not saying that they're patriotic to the United States that doesn't exist. They are invoking the English Whigs of 1688-89 and the Glorious Revolution, standing up for what they would see as their traditional English liberties, going back until time immemorial. And so it's very, very important to the leadership of these protests. I think protest movement is a better word than revolutionary movement in this period, in the run-up to war. And once war begins, they are incredibly committed to playing this war by the rules that as they understand them, because they desperately want to be seen as legitimate. They do not want to be seen as rebels. To be a rebel is to be a Jacobite, is to be a papist. This is not what they are suggesting, right? They see themselves as the lawful heirs of the glorious revolution of 1688, not latter-day Jacobites trying to overthrow the Hanoverian dynasty and the Restoration settlement. So does that get your part of your question, I think, about what they would say. So it depends on the time. And so one of the things I do in my book is chart an evolution in colonial thinking and American thinking about these issues and actions. When the leaders of the Continental Congress come together in the fall of 1774, in September of 1774, with the First Continental Congress, this is not a legislature. This is merely a congregation, a congress, a group of people coming together, what John Adams will later call a diplomatic assembly from 13 separate English colonies, trying to organize as best as possible what they understand to be a lawful protest against the usurpations of Parliament. So this explains, at least in part, I would argue, their deep commitment to, once shooting starts, to playing by these European norms.
It strikes me that this is a good point at which to double back to that Civil War
Mm.
conversation, and to what extent is the American Revolution sort of US Civil War 0.5,
Mhm.
or is it sort of the original Civil War um, that leads to separation? And it's interesting to hear you talk about sort of that desire for this to not be a rebellion. Um, because as you say, fundamentally, the focus is, well, look, we want redress for our grievances. That's the initial aim. It's not we want a separatist nation. It's we want our worldview to be embraced by the government and particularly the king. And so there's a lot of sort of push towards that, which then escalates into war. But I mean, look, you're much closer to this than I am. I'm a Napoleonicist. You're an American revolutionist, if that's a term. So what's your take on this?
So I would say at first, right, this is very much a British Civil War. If by British we mean the union of Scotland and England in 1707 and their colonies, right? This is a conflict between people who believe that they are heirs of the tradition of English liberties and English rights dating back to 1215 in Magna Carta, perhaps even earlier with the sort of ancient constitution of Britons before the Norman yoke is imposed upon them. These are people who see themselves very much as operating within an English political culture, and resort to arms is not new. Obviously, Parliament had resort to arms in 1642 when they believed that Charles I had grown tyrannical, and again in 1688. Now, oftentimes the Glorious Revolution is referred to as glorious because it's not bloody, but then you ask the Irish about that, right? There may be no conflict. James runs away before there can be any conflict in England. But the war will carry on in Ireland and be particularly destructive. And so, one fabulous historian of late 17th century Britain refers to this as the War of the Three Kingdoms. And in at that period, and in many ways, the American Revolution begins in that mold as a conflict over issues of sovereignty, over issues of representation, and over issues of the rights of freeborn English people. It's very much in that mold, as we'll see. It evolves. So I would argue that certainly this is a civil war within the British Empire. They are speaking the same language. They are heirs to the same political culture. They're using the same language, even as they talk past one another in this initial phase. Let's say 1774 1775. The British ministry, in particular, the Earl of Dartmouth, and then followed by Lord George Germain as colonial secretary, is going to make a decision in really in 1774, although it's not implemented until 1775, which is that this rebellion cannot be tolerated. We do not have the land forces to be able to subdue 2.5 million people by force of arms. But rebellions are, this is a slippery slope. It's a domino theory. We let these colonists rebel. There are 26 British colonies in North America. If we let these 13 go, what's going to happen to the rest? In particular, the Sugar Islands, the West Indies, places like Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, where the real money is. So we can't have that. And so the decision is made to employ auxiliary forces to suppress this rebellion. This is not new. The Hanoverian crown had done this, dynasty had done this during the Jacobite Rebellion. There were Hessian soldiers deployed to Scotland then. There were regiments of Scottish militia and regulars that were raised among the Highlanders to suppress the Jacobite Rebellion. This is an old decision, but they make a decision to arm people that they would see as loyalists, people who would remain loyal to the crown. They would make a decision in a limited, sort of a limited decision to arm and emancipate certain enslaved people. And they would make a decision very early on to put arms and incite indigenous people on the western frontier of these colonies, and perhaps even more existentially challenging to colonial New Englanders, in particular, to arm French Catholic Canadians against this rebellion and use these sort of proxy forces. What one of my colleagues, Rob Parkinson, calls proxies, the king's proxies, to suppress this rebellion. In so doing, they inadvertently inaugurate, I argue, an American Civil War. That this begins very much as you might argue it. I can see an argument for this being an English Civil War, because it is truly an English political culture that they're invoking. It's certainly a civil war within the British Empire, but within a year of fighting at Lexington and Concord, this is very much already an American Civil War, pitting various factions of colonial Americans against one another. And in so doing, they're going to escalate, in my opinion, inadvertently or unintentionally, the violence of this conflict exponentially.
I would love to sit down with you, and I'm sure we will at the Consortium of the Revolutionary Era or the SMH at some point, and really dig into this notion the British are fully aware that they don't have the manpower to functionally conquer the 13 colonies, because there is this wonderful, I mean, that's such a wonderful take on, or different take on the whole sort of they're fighting the world's greatest empire and all of that sort of the American exceptionalism rise, which we will get to a certain extent. But that's something I'd really love to talk to you about. But I want to pick you up on the end there, because that sort of feeds in really nicely. Your book really talks about and highlights how the republicanization of both the fledgling US state and with it the overall war effort in the Americas throw the established European ideas about war in general, but especially about prisoners of war, about monopolies of violence, about the limitization of force out the window. So talk us through that process in terms of how and why that develops. Or to put it another way, talk us through your entire book in 5 minutes.
Wow. Yes, this was something I was really quite surprised to find, actually. We'll start back again with King George's proxies and the use of indigenous people, formerly enslaved, self-liberated people, and of course, American loyalists, people that they would call insurgents or rebels, against them, right, to suppress this rebellion, is going to convince many American revolutionaries who certainly were upset with Parliament, very upset, but love their king. And I really take them at their word when they profess their loyalty to George, who they see as a patriot king, that he will stand up and protect them against this tyranny of his ministers in Parliament. Being British was incredibly important to these people, and to give that up, it took a lot. But putting guns in the hands of French Catholics and indigenous people and sending them to attack peaceful settlements, that's a really motivating factor for people who might not be super motivated about issues of virtual representation versus direct representation, issues of, well, can Parliament tax trade like through the Townsend duties? Is that an extension of the Navigation Act of 1651, or is that are they raising taxes for the purpose of revenue? These sort of very almost to us that seem almost trivial, but concerns that so animated the Patriot resistance movement, that is no longer going to be the case after the King's troops are shooting American militia, right? Once the shooting starts, and it's going to escalate pretty quickly. And so the revolutionaries at this point, radicals among them, right, are going to say that it is common sense, to use Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet. It is common sense that, in fact, this king and this British Constitution that we believe made us free is not, right? It's corrupt and it's tyrannical, and the only source of sovereignty, the only king of kings, is God, and then if not God, it is the people, right? Sovereignty comes from the people and the consent of the governed, and this is really quite a radical idea. There are antecedents, of course, in 17th century English political thought, and they are steeped in that language, sort of a country Whig language of resistance, but this transformation, the realization that we're creating 13 separate and sovereign republics, right, without a monarch, we are going to get rid of this. We're going to declare our independence and our perpetual union with one another. It is going to open up a sort of Pandora's box, right? Once the king is dead, right? You can't say the king is dead, long live the king, right? Who is going to enter the power vacuum? Right. And this presents a real problem because it would be very easy for us to point to the Continental Congress and say, well, the Continental Congress is after 4th of July, 1776 is a national legislature, and that makes sense, and we have a nation, and they're going to raise a Continental Army to fight this war. But no, right? In fact, each of these 13 colonies were tremendously different from one another, have very different histories, were mutually suspicious and jealous. They had very little in common beyond their grievances against Parliament and now the king in Parliament. And so bringing them together under a sort of national authority is impossible. It doesn't happen until the ratification of the Constitution a decade plus later. So what happens is you have the Continental Congress, which begins as a sort of diplomatic assembly, trying to manage a war on a continental scale, and I do mean a continental scale. They invade Canada. It's one of the first military campaigns of the conflict. They'll send continental naval vessels into the Pacific, or not the Pacific, excuse me, into the Caribbean Sea and against the home islands. So this is becoming already a much bigger war than just in the environs around Boston. But so we have the Continental Congress that claims some authority over running this war, appointing a commander, but each colony and then state is going to jealously guard their own prerogatives, right? They're not going to want to give power up to a national legislature. And this, you can hear them say things like, "We didn't want to be ruled by a parliament 3,000 miles away. Why do we want to be ruled by a Congress 300 miles away?" This is not the goal. This is not the purpose, right? And so consequently, each of these individual states is going to prosecute the war on their own, right? They're going to raise individual state troops as well as regiments for continental service. Many of them will engage in their own campaigns, as I chart in the course of the book, as this becomes an American Civil War, and in the aftermath of independence, when American loyalists are now treated as rebels and traitors, the states are going to be the ones prosecuting those conflicts, suppressing loyalism. And so the Continental Congress and General Washington all have to sort of triangulate between their various claims on authority. And in so doing, they fail to achieve the bedrock of early modern state formation, which we were talking about, right? They fail to achieve this monopoly on violence. Congress can't tell the states what to do. They can recommend, but they can't tell them. Washington can't do anything without Congress's approval and the cooperation of the individual states. And so consequently, the constituent individual people in this republic, if authority comes not from some union of monarch, the commons, and the aristocracy in some balanced and mixed constitution, if authority comes from the consent of the people in our individual states, well, then these new governments need to be responsible to their constituents. And in fact, we see a wave of democratization at the state level in the individual legislatures. Ordinary people would have had no authority in the sort of deferential patriarchal society that was late 18th century British North America, are going to now exert great influence at local levels over politics and over the conduct of war. And people will really start taking war into their own hands, again, escalating the violence. And prisoners of war as captives who might be captured by state forces, they might be captured by continental forces. Continental forces can't afford to pay for them, right? Because the Continental Congress does not have the ability to tax, are going to be foisted on these states, and prisoners of war are going to become sort of ideal objects of vengeance in this the escalating violence of this conflict. And they're going to become the sort of perfect locus upon which you can wreak your vengeance, to use one of their phrases.
Obviously, it's really important that we go and explore that in more depth, which we will do in just a moment. But one of the things that we picked out when we were prepping this was the role of fear within
Mhm.
this system, which works in many directions, right? One is the classic fear that the parliamentarians have during the English Civil War, that look, you know, we can beat the king as many times as we'd like, and he is still the king. If he beats us once, we are dead. We are traitors and we will be executed. So there's obviously that element of fear that if this is not successful, this is only ending one way, and that's with people being made an example of. The other key facet to this, and I'm very struck here by the similarities with the work of Matthew Taylor in his book Black Redcoats, is escaped slaves, and what dangers does as you put it, sort of self-emancipating former slave population pose to the safety of the people in a country that, well, in a state, let's say, using the term in the loosest possible words, um, that is in many cases very heavily based upon African slaves who might take the opportunity of all of this chaos that is about to ensue to take matters into their own hands, and numbers will tell, right? The fledgling United States is struggling to organize itself. It doesn't need an interior revolt on top of their own revolt of sorts. So how does fear play into this, particularly from a prisoner of war perspective? Now, my immediate reaction here is that an escaped slave would not be regarded as a prisoner of war because, as Matthew points out in his book, in the War of 1812, that they're regarded as property, and as such, they are a commercial item, much as frankly animals and beasts of burden would be regarded. Um, Nonetheless, I'm curious about whether either side tries to sort of play this to their own advantage, and I'm sure they do, in terms of how can we utilize this opportunity to our own ends, which is a very sort of waffly question, but there's something interesting in there, but I don't have the knowledge to frame the question properly, is what I'm really
No,
getting
no,
at.
it's very clear. It's tremendously important and central to my book and my analysis. I'll first just say that when the signers of the Declaration of Independence put their names on there and pledged their lives and sacred honor, they meant it. It was entirely possible that should they be captured, that they would face the hangman's noose, or or if they were very lucky, they might face the axe on Tower Hill. So this was treason, what they were engaging in, and by killing the king's troops, they're in effect engaging in symbolic regicide. So no different than the English Civil War. So these memories, and the memories of the English Civil War in particular, are going to haunt this generation, the leadership of this generation in particular. So that's the first thing. But the more pressing concern is again the decision by um, British military and political leaders, in particular Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief in North America at the beginning of the conflict, and the colonial secretary, Lord Dartmouth, to incite these proxies, right? I've mentioned before, French Canadians, indigenous people, and even the possibility, Gage says, that we should free the enslaved population. Now, the enslaved population of South Carolina is over 60%. It's a black majority. Virginia, it's something like 40%. There are slaves in every colony, all 13. It's the law of the land. And so consequently, this is a real threat. It's a threat symbolically to Collins' understanding of property rights. Their rights as freeborn Englishmen. The purpose of government is to establish life, liberty, and property. So right there, that's a big one, a big assault on them. But also to the emerging racialized social order in the Atlantic world that by the late 18th century, white colonial Americans saw people of African descent as inherently inferior, as beasts of burden who were suited for enslavement and not suited to be free and equal members of society. The idea that the crown would emancipate and then arm formerly enslaved people to try and, as Jefferson says, to cut the throats of their masters is an incredibly poignant and fear-producing idea. And it's one that revolutionary propagandists, or as Parkinson says, publicists, are going to use to their great advantage. One of the points I make in my book is the importance of the press as spreading horror stories about British violence against American prisoners of war, depredations by Hessians, who they see as mercenaries, Germanic mercenaries, somehow not quite European, but even more so, of course, by indigenous people and enslaved people. The British, for their part, never go full. They never fully embrace a policy of universal emancipation. It's always tempered by we're only going to free the enslaved people of rebels, right? So loyalists or even sort of moderate or disaffected people needn't worry. They're not particularly good at using enslaved people to their full potential. And in fact, many times the enslaved people will provide a logistical burden for British commanders rather than a boon. Again, because British Crown is unwilling to embrace wholesale emancipation, because to do so would be to tell Jamaica and Barbados and wherever else in the British Caribbean West Indian Empire that's coming for you too. And historians have made a lot of the Somerset decision, which was a 1772 ruling of the King's Bench, Court of the King's Bench, saying that something to the effect of that the air is too free in England for a slave to breathe. But there's nothing in English law that establishes slavery, nothing in positive law, nothing in common law, and slavery itself is not a natural state. And so natural law does not defend it either. So historians have made the point that many of these colonists, especially the large enslavers in the South, see the writing on the wall or fear the writing on the wall. And it doesn't take very much. A handful of black men in red coats is enough to terrify the planter aristocracy of the Chesapeake against Lord Dunmore, who's the royal governor there, and really help push many of these sort of moderates, people who were very fiercely committed to their English liberties and to who believed that It was the British tradition, British constitutional tradition that made them free, made them the freest, as I tell my students, the healthiest, wealthiest, and least taxed people in the world was all because of the British Constitution, constitutional tradition. To abandon that, right? To give that up in the favor of a Republican form of government, which they very quickly come to fear will be too democratical, to use their word. That giving ordinary people will start taking matters into their own hands, demanding rights and privileges that they previously did not have. They're no longer respecting their social betters. All of this leading to a sort of world turned upside down is really quite a nightmare for many of these elite colonial Americans. But yet the alternative seems worse. It seems if the King of England is making covenant with French Catholics, Native Americans, and enslaved people, then he's abandoned his colonial British North American subjects, and the only way forward is independence.
See, what I find very curious here is that when it comes to what is widely recognized as the US Civil War period, i.e., the one that happens in the middle of the 19th century, there is this ongoing nonsense debate about, oh, the US Civil War wasn't about slavery. And we had Andrew Leiter on recently who offered a very pithy kind of takedown of that. What I'm hearing from this is that when it comes to US Civil War zero point 0.5, a part of it is about slavery. So actually, you can make a case that in both US civil wars, there has been a significant slave element into this. Now, that's probably a comment that I can get away with without being lynched a little more easily on this side of the Atlantic than certain folks can on the other side of the Atlantic. But this is a really nice indicator of the way in which the problems that really come to the fore in terms of social inequality between fundamentally white Americans and difficult to know if black slaves would have been regarded as African Americans at this stage. I'm not sure, but I'm happy that the etymology kind of really works at this moment in time in terms of their recognition as people who have rights. But where I'm going with this, Waffle, is fundamentally like the origins go right back to state formation. And that problem that, you know, if Luke kind of quibs that all podcast hosts are equal, but some are more equal than others, then fundamentally at the core of the Declaration of the Rights of Man is all men are equal, but depending on what your skin pigmentation is, depends on quite how equal you may or fundamentally are not. Where am I going with this waffle? I mean, if you'd like to make comments on that as somebody who actually properly, deeply understands the history, both of you are very welcome to do so. And equally, if you want to sort of argue down with certain points of what I've said, please feel free. But equally, I'm very curious about the slave reaction here, in as much as we can ever get near to understanding what the attitudes of enslaved people were during this period, because you've got all of the challenges of trying to access those opinions, and a lot of the surviving material, of course, being fundamentally through the lens of the white people who've recorded it. But do we get any sense of the enslaved populations kind of looking at this as an opportunity that they might be able to take advantage of?
It's a great question. And it's one I didn't do as much in my first book as I should have, and I'm rectifying that now in the current book I'm writing. We'll begin with the issue of, it's become in vogue in certain scholarly circles to suggest that slavery and the potential British abolition of slavery in the Americas was one of the primary causes of America's break with Britain. and in particular in independence. And I would not go so far as to suggest that at all. That said, for colonial British Americans who are looking for a king who has abandoned them, who has abrogated his responsibilities, they need to look no farther than the king's representative in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, offering emancipation to enslaved people, right? This is what they see is a clear violation of the laws of property, as well as the social violation of the social order, right? So it's absolutely an accelerant. And Jefferson, in his initial draft of the Declaration of Independence, spells it out very clearly that the king is arming our enslaved people to cut our own throats. And that really would have resonated specifically with the Southern population. What about enslaved people themselves? You're exactly right. Enslaved people were very well aware that the system was exploitative, that it was enforced by violence, that it was degrading, and they resisted it at all points. And resistance varied from sort of passive resistance to more active forms of resistance. But wars offer opportunities for marginalized people to exploit these divisions and try and improve their station. And absolutely, enslaved people realize that this conflict with first Parliament and then the King is going to provide opportunities for them. So when General Gage writes to Lord Dartmouth, suggesting that maybe we should free enslaved people and arm them, it's because enslaved people have run away to his camp and have told him that they will fight. That they know who their enemy is. It's their enslavers. And there is a belief, a widespread belief that slavery is not legal in England, and that the king does not support it, and that if only the king could just enforce the laws over here, they would all be free. And so many enslaved people do take this opportunity to self-liberate, to run away to British lines, and many serve in an auxiliary capacity, and others serve in combat capacities. There are units raised over the course of the war that serve actively alongside American provincial or loyalist forces and British forces in general to great effect. There are even some units that are fairly integrated between self-liberated people and white Americans, loyalists. So then the question is, how do the revolutionaries respond? Well, this is just a great piece. If you need a piece of propaganda to convince people to go out and join the local militia, or to pay their taxes to the new state government, or to buy a war bond effectively from the Continental Congress. The idea that the British if they're going to come to your neighborhood, they're going to steal your slaves and then arm them against you is a really good motivation. Even if you don't own a slave, right? The equality, the sort of social equality that white British North Americans felt in large measure was predicated on keeping 500,000 enslaved people of African descent in bondage. Right? To be free was to be white, to be black was to be a slave. And the idea that the British are going to upset this social order that is so important part of your identity is going to be a really radicalizing factor over the course of the war. So you're 1,000% right. When enslaved people fall into revolutionary hands, either the Continental Army or state militias, they're not treated as prisoners of war. They're far more likely to be executed on the spot, to be brutalized. The state of Virginia is going to establish lead mines in the western part of the state and send captured enslaved people there to toil in subterranean conditions of unspeakable cruelty. They're auctioned on the spot. When there's an example in my book, I talk about an enslaved man who'd run away to the Hessians. He joined one of the Hessian regiments. He was a musician, I believe. He's captured at the Battle of Trenton. He's Several Continental Army officers have an auction right there on the battlefield. Right, there's still people screaming in pain. Prisoners are being gathered up. They have an auction right there to who wants to buy this person. Unlike the Hessian prisoners who are treated with great humanity at Washington's order. So his black skin is enough to take away the protections of the uniform that he's wearing, right? So these lawful protections of the laws of war that I argue the revolutionary elites are committed to at the beginning of this conflict, they don't apply to people that white British North Americans would see as uncivilized or inferior as chattel.
So the slave aspect of this and the free slave aspect of this, and to a certain extent the indigenous fighters portion of this, is relatively well known to people who read up on this subject. I want to talk a little bit about the French Catholics
Mm.
because that sort of is the less I don't mean to dismiss any of the others, but that is less well known, right? If we're talking about a war between Canada and the United States, we think immediately of 1812. We don't think of the American Revolution. But I mean, sort of, I'm reminded of the 1774 Quebec Act that gives French Catholics the right to serve in government a full 50 years before they get that right in Britain itself. Um, I want to know how that how those troops are
Mm.
how are they responded to in the general sense and in the propaganda sense and very much in an 18th century and even a 17th century sort of wars of religion feel almost, but
Hmm.
also in terms of prisoners of war when they are captured.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Colonial New Englanders had nursed an abiding hatred against their French Catholic neighbors in Canada since the beginning of colonization. They see them as an existential threat and had obviously volunteered in droves during the colonial wars, and in particular during the Seven Years' War, leading to the reduction of Canada and the incorporation of 70,000 French Catholic people into the Greater British Empire. This Greater British Empire, having come out of the Seven Years' War, the largely unrivaled global superpower, having won this amazing victory over the combined French-Spanish imperial powers, realizes that in order to govern a polyglot and a religiously pluralistic empire, they're going to need to incorporate local elites. They're going to need to have people on the ground. And to do that, they're going to have to do things like offer toleration for the Roman Catholic Church, to allow some semblance of Roman law to still be implied, to guarantee property rights. And in 1774, one of the most devastating things Parliament does in the Quebec Act is turn all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, into the province of Quebec, right? That sort of Trans-Appalachian West that had been contested during the Seven Years' War is now effectively put under the jurisdiction of a bunch of French Catholics, which you can imagine if you're sitting in Boston, how upsetting this would be. So within days of fighting at Lexington and Concord, the Massachusetts General Assembly or General Court, as well as the Connecticut Assembly, are going to send forces to capture Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, a key staging point for the Lake Champlain Hudson River corridor that will allow them to then be poised for an invasion into Canada. Now, initially, the revolutionaries believe that the Canadians will join them, that they will share this longstanding grievance against Great Britain, that they would be sort of natural allies. The British, of course, believe that the French Canadians will stand with them because they've offered all of these concessions, and obviously these descendants of Puritans from New England are hardly going to be good neighbors, right? As it turns out, most Canadians just want to be left out of this. They lost the war; they were conquered in 1761 and then confirmed in 1763. And so they just want to be left alone. Now, that doesn't mean that there are French Canadians who joined the revolutionaries. My colleague Holly Mayer's written a fabulous new book on the what becomes known as Congress's Own Regiment, which was raised in Canada from a French population. But the British, of course, also raise milice, French militia forces to serve with them in the defense of Canada. And here they do a pretty good job on the defensive. So French Canadians will serve with Carleton in the defense of Montreal. Montreal will fall, and its garrison become prisoners of war. But then they'll hold Quebec against Arnold's and Montgomery's attack near Christmas 1775. So in this way, the French Canadian population is willing to defend their homes against a New England invader, but they're much less willing to go on the offensive. Now, that does not mean that when John Burgoyne leads his expedition towards Albany in 1777, that there aren't French Canadian troops serving with him, because there are. Very oftentimes, alongside indigenous people and indigenous war parties. And when these prisoners, and I found a great case of one of these Frenchmen who was captured by Horatio Gates's army near Saratoga in September of 1777. And this French individual is captured alongside, I believe, a group of Wyandot people. And he's painted in war paint. He's wearing a loincloth and he's painted in war paint. He's not wearing European clothing, although he is of European descent. And the Continental Army decides that he should be treated as a savage, not as a civilized person, because he has effectively, he's abandoned his whiteness by going over to the Indians, and they allow him to be ritualistically tortured to death by some of their native allies. So that's a sort of aberration point. Most of the militia from Canada that's captured alongside Burgoyne's army are actually allowed to return to Canada. Unlike the British and Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau troops that are captured at Saratoga, they're allowed who go in become part of this convention army that I talk about in chapter 4 of my book. Unlike them, these guys are allowed to go back on their parole, which is actually quite a stretch of the rules of war, a very generous stretch of the rules of war, because common soldiers were not deemed in European terms to be honorable enough to be able to give their word of honor. You had to be a gentleman or an officer to be able to proffer a parole. But here, Gates is going to allow the Canadian militia to go home, in part because he knows that they're not good. They're not going to be any good for exchange. That the British aren't going to want to take them back to England, and he doesn't want to have to feed them and transport them. He's afraid they might run away, and it just cause more trouble. It's easier to let them go. Does that answer your point? I would say that there are fewer French Canadian troops in the British force than the British would have wanted, and there are fewer in the American forces than the Revolutionary Americans would have wanted.
I mean, this is fascinating. Such is the Alice in Wonderland nature of this podcast. We've spent 75 minutes talking about this and have barely actually got to any fundamental examples of prisoners of war and exchange and the new system and how it plays out in practice. However, that doesn't mean that we're just going to give up and forget everything and abandon the topic entirely. But with an eye on the time, what we are going to do, folks, is pause for this one. Not least because I think it's only fair to give guests a rest after nearly an hour and a half of almost constant enthusiasm, and allow them to just sort of breathe a little bit. So we will return with a part 2 to this. That means that I'm going to get the scholar in residence to go and re-record his introduction. So what you won't have realized until the end of this
Vindication!
is that what you'll be hearing is something like take 4 or take 5 of the intro. But Cole, wow, what an introduction to this topic. Folks, Captives of Liberty, Prisoners of War and the Politics of Vengeance in the American Revolution is published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Please do go and get your hands on a copy. Cole, thank you so much for bringing so much enthusiasm and depth and insight into the early phase of the American War of Independence / Revolution / Civil War 0.5. It's been fascinating. For the first time, I'm starting to feel that we might finally have a decent kind of coverage between this and other episodes that we've been doing lately on the the 13 colonies breaking away, I'm starting to feel like we might actually understand this properly now. And by we, frankly, I mean me. It's been such an interesting journey, and I really look forward to discussing this in much more depth with you in our second part, and fundamentally actually talking about prisoners of war, which was why we invited you on in the first place. So we will get back to that. The scholar in residence, the Beau, will no doubt be in touch with you to facilitate that. Folks, you have been listening to the Rabbit Hole podcast that focuses tangentially on the Napoleonic Wars, otherwise known as the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Folks, as the festive season approaches, consider whether you'd be willing to do any of these things to spread the Napoleonic cheer. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Then sign up to our newsletter by contacting us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get the regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a novel Christmas gift for the Napoleonicist in your life? Check out our merch via the link in the description in order to support our work while giving your loved ones something distinctive this winter. If you aren't in a position where you can dig into your pockets, then believe me, we totally get it. But that doesn't mean that you can't thank us for the episodes that you've enjoyed in a different way. All podcast platforms have ways for you to leave your reviews, so just spare us 2 minutes and leave a review wherever you listen to us. It makes a world of difference in boosting our international ranking and widening our reach. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and develop new exciting documentary channels. So if you want to be kept entertained on a daily basis when it comes to Napoleonic nerdery, prices start from just £2 a month. And you can, if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and the enigmatically named Zed. The Chiefs of Staff: that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.